"The wrong sister changed everything," the billionaire said, and for a moment, no one in the ballroom could breathe. 3 hours earlier, the Grand Lexington Hotel in downtown Chicago had been glowing beneath crystal chandeliers and golden light. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Cameras flashed. Conversations drifted through the air like soft music. Everyone knew why Ethan Parker was there. At 38, the Korean-American billionaire had become one of the most talked-about business leaders in the country. His technology empire stretched across continents. His decisions moved markets. And tonight, according to every rumor circulating through the room, he had come to meet Sophia Brooks. Sophia was impossible to miss. Elegant, charming, beautiful in a way that made people turn their heads the moment she entered a room. Guests greeted her with excitement. Photographers quietly adjusted their lenses whenever she walked by. She seemed perfectly at home beneath the attention. Most people assumed the evening was already written. The famous billionaire would meet the beautiful woman. The beautiful woman would impress the billionaire. The story would end exactly as everyone expected. But standing less than 20 feet away, carrying a silver tray of sparkling water, was someone nobody noticed. Naomi Brooks moved quietly between tables. Her black uniform blended into the background. Her name wasn't printed on any invitation. No camera pointed in her direction. Most guests never looked at her long enough to remember her face. She simply did her job, offering polite smiles, clearing empty glasses, and slipping through crowded spaces with practiced grace. If anyone had asked who the invisible waitress was, few people would have known she was Sophia's younger sister. Fewer still would have cared. Ethan Parker arrived shortly after 7 o'clock. The room immediately shifted. Conversations softened. Heads turned. He carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had spent years making difficult decisions without seeking approval. Expensive watch, tailored suit, quiet eyes that seemed to notice more than they revealed. He greeted investors, shook hands with donors, exchanged polite conversation. Yet several times throughout the evening, his gaze drifted away from the people trying hardest to impress him, toward someone else. Someone carrying coffee instead of business cards. Someone standing in the background while everyone else fought for attention. And as the night unfolded beneath the glow of crystal light, not a single person in that ballroom realized they were watching the beginning of a story that would leave an entire room speechless. Naomi Brooks had spent most of her life learning how to disappear. Not physically. People could see her standing there. They simply chose not to. The skill had developed slowly over the years, becoming as natural as breathing. When she was 10, neighbors praised Sophia's smile. When she was 16, teachers remembered Sophia's achievements first. When family friends visited, they often asked about Sophia before remembering there was another daughter in the house. Naomi never complained. Complaining would not change anything. Instead, she learned to listen, to observe, to find comfort in the quiet spaces that other people ignored. At 27, she worked 6 days a week at the Grand Lexington Hotel. The job paid enough to keep the lights on and the rent covered. Barely. Every morning began before sunrise. Every evening ended with tired feet and sore shoulders. Yet she carried herself with a calm dignity that few people noticed. Earlier that same day, before the ballroom filled with wealthy guests and polished smiles, Naomi had been sitting beside her mother's hospital bed. The room smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. Rain tapped softly against the window. Her mother had been sleeping. Naomi had spent 40 minutes reading aloud from an old novel because her mother said the sound of her voice made the room feel less lonely. When visiting hours ended, Naomi kissed her forehead, promised to return the next morning, and headed straight to work. She never mentioned these routines to anyone. They were simply part of who she was. By 7:30 that evening, the charity gala was in full swing. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath golden light. A pianist played softly near the center of the ballroom. Naomi moved quietly through the crowd carrying trays of drinks and appetizers. Most guests accepted them without looking up. Some never acknowledged her at all. She was used to that. Across the room, Sophia stood surrounded by conversation and attention. Her elegant blue dress caught the light every time she moved. People laughed at her stories. Business leaders introduced themselves. Cameras followed her from one side of the ballroom to the other. Naomi felt no jealousy. She loved her sister. Always had. Sophia had dreams that naturally attracted attention. Naomi preferred a different kind of life. At least that was what she told herself. Still, there were moments when the distance between them felt larger than the ballroom itself. As Naomi passed near one of the executive tables, she noticed Ethan Parker sitting quietly while others competed for his attention. Several guests were speaking at once, eager to impress him. Yet Ethan seemed distracted. His fingers rested lightly against a coffee cup that had already gone cold. His expression remained unreadable. Then something unexpected happened. While reaching for a glass, Naomi felt a strange sensation, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She glanced up briefly. Across the room, Ethan Parker was looking directly at her. Not past her. Not through her. The moment lasted only a second before another guest stepped between them. But for reasons she could not explain, Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. And somewhere beneath the music, the laughter, and the glittering illusion of the evening, something had quietly begun to change. Naomi quickly looked away and continued walking. Years of working in crowded rooms had taught her one important lesson. Attention rarely lasted. People noticed something for a moment and then moved on to whatever mattered more to them. She assumed this would be no different. Yet as the evening continued, Ethan Parker's behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. At first, it was subtle. A brief glance while she refilled a water glass. A quiet observation from across the ballroom. Nothing obvious enough for anyone else to notice. But Ethan had spent most of his adult life studying people. Billion-dollar negotiations often depended on understanding what others overlooked. He trusted patterns more than appearances. And something about Naomi did not fit the pattern. Every few minutes, someone approached him. Investors, politicians, entrepreneurs. They all wanted something. Partnership, an introduction, a photograph, a favor. Ethan listened politely, offered measured responses, and maintained the calm professionalism that had made him successful. Yet he found himself distracted. Across the room, Naomi continued working without seeking recognition. She moved from table to table with quiet efficiency. When an elderly donor accidentally dropped his program, she picked it up before he could bend down. When a nervous young employee struggled to carry a heavy tray, she stepped in and helped without drawing attention to herself. Each act was small, almost invisible. Most people never noticed. Ethan noticed every one of them. The strange part was that Naomi never stayed long enough to receive gratitude. She helped and moved on. No performance. No audience. No expectation of reward. Around 8:15, a minor accident interrupted the evening. One of the newer servers lost balance while carrying a tray of sparkling water. Several glasses tipped. Cold water splashed across the sleeve of an expensive suit belonging to a well-known investor. The room seemed to freeze. The young server immediately turned pale. Guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. The investor frowned as he stared at the wet fabric. Before anyone else reacted, Naomi appeared beside the young employee. She handed him a clean towel and quietly helped gather the fallen glasses. There was no panic in her voice. No criticism. Only calm reassurance. The nervous server nodded gratefully. Within minutes, the situation had been resolved. Most guests returned to their conversations. The moment disappeared, or at least everyone thought it had. Ethan had watched the entire exchange. What struck him was not the accident itself. It was Naomi's instinctive response. While others focused on the inconvenience, she focused on the person who was embarrassed. She protected his dignity before addressing the problem. It was a small choice, but character often revealed itself through small choices. Ethan leaned back in his chair and glanced toward the ballroom entrance. For a moment, the noise of the event faded into the background. An old memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 years earlier, a difficult season. a handwritten letter arriving on his desk at exactly the moment he needed it most. Advice from a stranger. Wisdom without a signature. Words he had never forgotten. He slowly turned his gaze back toward Naomi. Then something unusual happened. For the first time that evening, Ethan smiled. Not the practiced smile used for cameras. Not the polite smile reserved for business meetings. A genuine one. As though a puzzle he had been carrying for years had suddenly revealed its first missing piece. The ballroom had begun to shift into its second rhythm of the evening, where conversations grew louder, glasses were refilled more often, and attention slowly drifted away from formal introductions into more relaxed exchanges. Yet Ethan Parker remained unusually still. While others around him leaned forward into laughter and negotiation, he leaned back slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. His eyes continued to return to Naomi Brooks, each glance more intentional than the last. Naomi, unaware of the silent focus now directed toward her, continued her work with steady precision. She checked each table twice before moving on, adjusted napkins that did not need adjusting, and ensured that every guest received the same level of quiet respect. She did not perform kindness. She practiced it. Across the room, Sophia Brooks noticed the shift before anyone else did. She was used to attention. It followed her everywhere like a shadow she had learned to live with. But attention that once felt certain now felt slightly displaced. She saw Ethan speaking with a group of donors, yet his gaze kept breaking away, following something, or someone. Sophia turned subtly, trying to trace the direction of his focus. It was not difficult. It led to the service corridor where Naomi had just stepped out with an empty tray. Sophia hesitated. For most of her life, comparisons had been unnecessary. People naturally placed her at the center of the room. Yet now, for reasons she did not fully understand, she felt something unfamiliar. Not jealousy exactly, more like confusion. Ethan excused himself from his conversation with a calm nod and began walking slowly across the ballroom. No urgency. No announcement. Just movement with intention. Guests assumed he was heading toward another important discussion. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. But instead of approaching another executive table, he stopped near the edge of the service area. Naomi had just returned, setting down her tray carefully before turning back toward the crowd. She nearly walked past him without noticing. Then she stopped, because Ethan Parker was standing directly in her path. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade slightly, as if the space between them created its own silence. Naomi adjusted her posture instinctively, unsure whether she had done something wrong. Ethan studied her not like a host at a gala, but like someone trying to confirm a thought he had not yet spoken aloud. Then he asked a simple question, calm and direct, without performance or ceremony. He asked her name. Naomi hesitated for only a second before answering. Her voice was soft but steady. Around them, the world continued moving. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose. Music played without interruption. Yet something had changed in the smallest possible way. Not visible to the crowd. Not announced. But irreversible. Ethan repeated her name once, as if testing it against memory rather than sound. Then he nodded slightly, as though confirming something to himself. Behind them, Sophia watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. For the first time that evening, the story everyone thought they understood no longer felt predictable. And Ethan Parker, the man who rarely made decisions without certainty, continued standing in front of a woman no one had truly seen until now. For a moment, the world around them seemed to lose its balance in the smallest possible way. Ethan Parker remained standing in front of Naomi Brooks, as if the noise of the ballroom had moved somewhere far away and no longer mattered. Naomi felt it immediately. This was not the usual interaction she had with guests. There was no polite dismissal, no rushed request, no distracted glance. Ethan was paying attention in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling in its focus. She tightened her grip on the empty tray in her hands, unsure whether she was being evaluated or simply seen. Ethan, on the other hand, felt something he rarely allowed himself to experience without control. curiosity without calculation. He had built his entire career on recognizing value before others did. Markets, people, opportunities. Everything was a pattern waiting to be understood. Yet Naomi did not fit any familiar pattern. She was neither trying to impress nor trying to disappear. She simply existed in a way that felt grounded, unperformed. Around them, guests continued their evening unaware of the shift happening at the edge of the room. Sophia Brooks remained in the distance, watching silently, her earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter and harder to define. Ethan finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a subtle weight behind it, as if each word had been considered carefully before being spoken. He asked what she did when she was not working. The question was simple, almost ordinary, but Naomi paused before answering. No one usually asked her about anything beyond her role in the moment. She answered honestly, saying she worked multiple shifts and spent her remaining time caring for her family. There was no attempt to make it sound impressive. No effort to invite sympathy. It was stated the same way someone might describe the weather. Ethan listened without interruption. No glance at his phone. No distraction. Only attention. That alone made Naomi feel slightly uncertain. People like him usually did not stay present for long. Yet he did not move. He asked a second question, softer this time. Not about her work, but about her. What she wanted. The question lingered between them longer than expected. Naomi hesitated again. It was not that she did not know the answer. It was that no one had asked her in so long that she had stopped preparing one. Before she could respond fully, a staff coordinator approached from behind, quietly reminding her that she was needed at another table. Naomi gave a small nod, stepping slightly back as if grateful for the interruption. But as she turned to leave, Ethan spoke once more. Not loudly, not demanding, simply stating that he would like to continue their conversation later. It was not framed as an invitation she could easily ignore. It was stated with the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to follow through. Naomi acknowledged it with a brief nod before walking away, disappearing back into the flow of service. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, watching her until she blended into the movement of the room again. Only then did he slowly turn away. Behind him, the evening continued unchanged on the surface. Glasses were lifted, conversations resumed, laughter returned, but something had already shifted beneath it all. And for the first time since entering the ballroom, Ethan Parker was no longer interested in the people trying to be seen. He was interested in the one person who never tried at all. Naomi Brooks moved through the remainder of her shift with the same quiet discipline she always carried, but something inside her felt subtly altered. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel the difference in the weight of each step. The ballroom no longer felt entirely predictable. Every time she passed near the edge of the executive tables, she became aware of presence rather than just people. Ethan Parker was still there, still surrounded by conversations that demanded attention. Yet she could sense, even without looking, that his awareness occasionally returned to her. She focused on her work, reminding herself that guests like him often asked questions out of curiosity that faded by morning. That had always been her experience with people who lived in a different world. When her shift finally ended close to midnight, the hotel outside had cooled into a quiet Chicago night. The air carried the faint scent of rain on pavement, and streetlights reflected softly across the wet sidewalks. Naomi stepped out through the staff exit, adjusting her coat as she prepared for the long ride home. Before heading to the bus stop, she checked her phone. There was a reminder she already knew by heart. Hospital payment due in 2 days. She did not sigh. She never allowed herself that luxury. Instead, she folded the phone back into her pocket and began walking. Her apartment was not far, but it was far enough that most guests from the ballroom would never have imagined someone like her living within the same city as them. The building was modest, the kind of place where elevators worked only sometimes and hallways carried the faint echo of other people's lives. Inside her small unit, Naomi moved quietly so as not to wake her sleeping mother in the adjacent room. Her mother's condition had been stable, but fragile stability still required constant attention. Naomi placed a small container of food in the refrigerator, checked the medication schedule written neatly on the counter, and sat down for a moment at the edge of the bed. The silence in the room was different from the silence of the ballroom. This one was heavy, familiar, and honest. She allowed herself only a few seconds of stillness before standing again. There was always something to do, always something to prepare for tomorrow. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Parker remained in motion long after the gala had ended. He did not return directly to his hotel suite. Instead, he asked his driver to take a longer route through downtown Chicago. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but his attention was not on the skyline. It was on a pattern he could not ignore. A woman who did not seek recognition yet carried herself with unmistakable discipline. A presence that did not align with her position. And a silence that felt intentional rather than accidental. He opened a folder on his tablet, reviewing the guest list from the evening. Names, affiliations, background summaries. Sophia Brooks appeared exactly as expected. Influential, visible, widely connected. But Naomi Brooks had very little information attached to her name. That absence itself felt unusual in a place like the Grand Lexington. Ethan closed the tablet and leaned back slightly, eyes reflecting the passing lights outside. For the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about markets, contracts, or expansion strategies. He was thinking about gaps, missing information, stories that did not align with appearances. And somewhere in that quiet space between curiosity and certainty, he made a decision without announcing it to anyone. He would learn more about Naomi Brooks. The following morning in Chicago arrived under a pale gray sky, with clouds hanging low enough to soften the edges of the city. Inside the Grand Lexington Hotel, the world had already returned to its usual rhythm. Staff moved efficiently through polished hallways. Breakfast service began with quiet precision. Guests from the previous night prepared for meetings, flights, and departures, as if the evening before had been nothing more than a brief moment of elegance that no longer mattered. Yet for Ethan Parker, something about the night had stayed with him longer than expected. He sat alone in a corner of the hotel's executive lounge, a black coffee untouched in front of him, his tablet open but ignored. He had been awake for hours before sunrise, replaying fragments of the previous evening in his mind. Not the speeches, not the formal introductions, not the familiar faces of investors and executives. Only one detail continued to return without permission. Naomi Brooks, a name that had carried no weight in the room, yet now carried more presence in his thoughts than anyone else from the entire event. He had already instructed his team to begin a discreet background review. Not because he distrusted her, but because experience had taught him that unanswered questions were rarely meaningless. If something stood out in a room full of predictable patterns, it was usually because there was something beneath the surface waiting to be understood. By mid-morning, the preliminary report arrived. Ethan read it slowly, expression unchanged. Employment records confirmed what he already knew. Naomi Brooks worked multiple service positions across different venues. No public presence. No corporate affiliations. No visible attempts at recognition or advancement in traditional systems. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. But Ethan did not stop at first glance. He read between the lines the way he always did. The timing of her shifts, the consistency of her work history, the lack of instability despite financial pressure signals that appeared in subtle data points. There was discipline here, not desperation. That distinction mattered to him more than most people realized. At the same time, across the city, Naomi was beginning her second job of the day at a small community cafe near a medical center. The environment was different from the hotel, less polished, more personal. Regular customers greeted her by name, though few ever asked questions beyond small talk. She worked with the same quiet focus, balancing trays, remembering orders, and ensuring no detail was overlooked. Between customers, she checked her phone briefly, a reminder about her mother's next appointment. She adjusted her schedule in silence, calculating time the way other people calculated opportunity. There was no room for error. Every hour had a purpose. Every decision had a consequence. Later that afternoon, Ethan made an unexpected decision. Instead of delegating further inquiry, he left the hotel. He did not inform the press office. He did not schedule a meeting. He simply walked out through a side entrance and entered a black vehicle waiting outside. His driver asked for instructions. Ethan paused for a moment, then gave an address pulled from the preliminary report. The cafe location. The city moved past the windows as the vehicle crossed downtown streets, but Ethan's attention remained inward. He was not sure what he expected to find. That was unusual for him. He usually arrived at conclusions before arriving at places. But this time, the conclusion had not formed yet. When he arrived, the cafe appeared unremarkable from the outside. Glass windows, simple signage, light movement inside. Yet as he stepped in, the atmosphere subtly shifted. Not because of him, but because of recognition from staff who understood exactly who he was, even if they pretended not to. Naomi was behind the counter, tying her apron, preparing for the next wave of customers. She looked up as the bell above the door chimed. Their eyes met again, this time outside the controlled environment of last night's gala. There were no chandeliers, no audience, no expectations. Only silence between two people who had begun to notice each other without fully understanding why. And in that quiet moment, Ethan realized something he had not yet admitted even to himself. He was no longer observing her out of curiosity. He was searching for something he believed only she might explain. Naomi Brooks froze for only a fraction of a second when she saw Ethan Parker standing inside the cafe. It was not fear. It was not surprise in the dramatic sense people often imagine in stories. It was something quieter. The awareness that a private routine had just intersected with something unpredictable. She adjusted her posture naturally, smoothing her apron as she always did when beginning a shift, and stepped forward with professional calm. Around her, the cafe continued its normal rhythm. A couple near the window discussed travel plans. A student tapped lightly on a laptop keyboard. The sound of a coffee machine filled the background like steady rain. Ethan remained near the entrance for a moment longer than expected. He was not looking at the menu. He was not scanning the room for a seat. He was looking at her. Naomi approached, offering a polite greeting that matched the environment. Her voice was steady, controlled, and unchanged from any other customer interaction. Ethan responded, but his attention did not shift to the usual formalities. Instead, he asked a question that did not belong to the setting. He asked how long she had been working 2 jobs. The question was simple, but it disrupted the expected structure of conversation. Naomi hesitated briefly before answering honestly. She did not ask why he was there. She did not comment on his presence. She simply provided the information as she always did when asked directly. Ethan listened without interruption. There was no distraction in his expression. No glance toward his phone, no sign of impatience. It was the same focused attention he had shown the night before, but now it felt even more deliberate. After a moment, he stepped further into the cafe and chose a seat near the counter rather than a private table in the corner. It was a small decision, but it changed the energy of the space. Naomi noticed it immediately, though she did not comment. She returned to her duties, preparing drinks and taking orders, but her awareness of him remained in the background of everything she did. Ethan observed the cafe quietly, not with judgment, but with calculation softened by curiosity. He noticed how Naomi moved between tasks without hesitation, how she adjusted to interruptions without losing rhythm, how she responded to small problems before they became visible to customers. There was efficiency here, but also restraint. Nothing was wasted. Not movement, not speech, not attention. At one point, a customer at the far table struggled to understand their order receipt. Before the situation escalated into frustration, Naomi stepped in, clarified the misunderstanding, and resolved it without drawing unnecessary attention. She returned immediately to work, as if nothing notable had happened. Ethan watched this carefully. It was not the action itself that stood out. It was the absence of expectation behind it. Later, during a brief pause in activity, Ethan finally spoke again. He did not ask about business. He did not ask about background. He asked a question that seemed almost out of place in its simplicity. He asked what she would do if she were not constantly working. Naomi paused longer this time, not because she did not understand, but because the question required her to step outside a routine she rarely questioned. She looked down briefly at her hands, then gave an answer that was honest but quiet. She said she was not sure anymore. The response lingered between them longer than expected. Ethan did not immediately reply. Instead, he studied her expression with a focus that felt less like observation and more like recognition of something unspoken. For a brief moment, the noise of the cafe faded into the background again, and in that small stretch of silence, it became clear that this was no longer a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something neither of them had yet named. The cafe had grown quieter as the afternoon light shifted through the front windows, stretching soft reflections across the wooden tables. Customers came and went in steady rhythm, but Naomi Brooks moved through each task with the same controlled focus she had maintained since the start of her shift. Ethan Parker remained seated near the counter, no longer observing the space as a visitor, but as someone attempting to understand it from within. He had not touched his drink in several minutes. Instead, his attention remained on Naomi, not in a way that demanded interruption, but in a way that suggested permanence. Naomi felt it, even without looking directly at him. That awareness had become difficult to ignore. Yet she continued working, refusing to let it alter her pace or her discipline. Around 4 in the afternoon, the cafe experienced a brief lull. The bell above the door stopped ringing for several minutes, and the hum of conversation faded into background silence. It was in this rare stillness that Ethan finally stood and approached the counter. Naomi looked up as he arrived, maintaining the same professional composure she offered every customer. Ethan paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, then asked a question that shifted the atmosphere again. He asked whether she had ever considered a life that did not revolve around survival. Naomi blinked slightly at the phrasing, not offended, but thoughtful. No one had ever framed her life in those terms so directly. Survival was not something she usually named. It was simply assumed, like weather or gravity. She responded honestly, explaining that she had responsibilities that required stability, not uncertainty. There was no complaint in her voice, only fact. Ethan listened, then nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected rather than discovering something new. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked briefly around the cafe, observing the simplicity of the environment, the quiet structure of routine, the predictable flow of labor. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured. He said that most people he had met spent their lives trying to become visible, yet she seemed to have mastered the opposite without trying. Naomi did not answer right away. The statement was neither praise nor criticism, but it carried weight in its observation. She simply continued preparing an order, allowing the moment to exist without forcing meaning onto it. A few minutes later, a regular customer entered the cafe, greeted Naomi warmly, and asked about her mother's health. It was a small interaction, easily overlooked by anyone else in the room. But Ethan noticed it. The way Naomi's expression softened slightly. The way she answered with brief gratitude before returning to work. There was something consistent in her behavior. She did not separate her roles into public and private versions of herself. She simply remained the same person across all situations. As the afternoon continued, Ethan returned to his seat, but his focus had shifted completely. He was no longer analyzing her through fragments of behavior. He was beginning to see a pattern that did not rely on external validation. It was not wealth, education, or status that defined her presence. It was consistency under pressure. Later, as Naomi prepared to end her shift, Ethan approached once more. This time, he did not ask a question immediately. He simply said her name again, as if confirming that it belonged to someone real rather than an idea he had constructed in his mind. Naomi stopped, meeting his gaze for a brief moment. The cafe around them continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that something unspoken had settled into the space between two people who had begun to understand each other without needing permission from the world outside.